On the 13th of April, 2026, the Michigan State Police announced that they had solved the abduction and murder of a 16-year-old girl who left her house one Wednesday morning in November of 1983 and never arrived at school. Her name was Sheri Jo Elliott. She lived on Seneca Street in Flint. She walked out the front door at 6:30 in the morning, in the dark, to catch a bus she caught every day. 4 days later, a man out checking his muskrat traps found her in a drainage ditch beside a farm road, 35 miles north, in a township most people in Flint had never heard of. But the detail that has haunted this case for 43 years is not where she was found. It is when. The trapper checked those lines every single day. The day before, that ditch was empty. And the medical records said she was probably still alive as late as the 19th. Which means that for roughly 3 days, somewhere nobody has ever found, Sheri Jo Elliott was alive and being held. The man the police finally named lived 15 miles from her house. He was never a suspect. And in January of 2026, a few weeks before the announcement, he took his own life. To understand the shape of this case, you have to understand what Flint, Michigan was in the autumn of 1983, because it explains both the police department and the silence. Flint was a General Motors city. Not a city with a General Motors plant in it, a city that existed because of General Motors. Buick was born there. At its peak, something like 80,000 people in that county worked for the company. By 1983 that was coming apart. The recession at the start of the decade had gutted the plants. Unemployment in Genesee County ran into the high teens and beyond. People were leaving. A city that is losing 30,000 jobs does not have a large cold case unit. It has a homicide caseload that goes up every year and a budget that goes down every year. None of that is an excuse, and none of it is the reason her case went unsolved. The reason her case went unsolved is that in 1983, the evidence they collected could not be read yet. But the context matters, because it explains how a file like this can go quiet for 40 years. The north end of Flint, where the Elliott family lived, was streets of small wooden framed houses set close together, built for auto workers in the boom, and by 1983 holding a mix of families who had stayed and families who could not leave. Seneca Street runs through that part of the city. 2 blocks over is Clio Road, which is the main road north, 4 lanes, buses, gas stations, the road you walk to if you are catching a ride anywhere. It is worth being concrete about the scale of what was happening to that city, because it is the water this case is swimming in. Flint lost tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs across a decade. Whole streets emptied out. The tax base that pays for detectives went with them. A homicide file in a city like that does not get closed by neglect. It gets closed by arithmetic. There are only so many detectives, and the cases keep arriving, and a case with no witness and no suspect eventually loses to a case with both. November in mid-Michigan is its own fact in this story too. The leaves are down. The fields are cut. It gets dark before 5 in the afternoon and it is still dark at 7 in the morning. Which is to say, a 16-year-old walking to a bus stop at 6:30 in the morning that week was walking in the dark, and everybody in Flint knew it, and nobody thought anything of it, because that is simply what winter mornings were. Sheri Jo Elliott was 16. She was a student at Carmen High School on the west side of the city. She worked part-time as a babysitter, which in 1983 for a 16-year-old girl meant most Friday and Saturday nights, for a couple of dollars an hour, in other people's living rooms. The people who knew her described her in words that show up again and again in the file. Shy. Intelligent. And, this is the one that sits badly now, always careful around strangers. She had not been living in Flint very long. Before that she had lived with her father in Charlotte, a small town about 70 miles to the southwest, out past Lansing. She had moved up to Flint to live with her mother. New city, new school, new bus route, new walk in the mornings. Her mother was Joyce Schultz. Sheri Jo was her only child. Her mother had remarried. Her stepfather was a man named Robert Schultz. Remember that name, because the police are going to spend a long time looking at him, and he is going to spend the rest of his life carrying it. Wednesday, the 16th of November, 1983. Sunrise in Flint that week was around 7:20 in the morning. Sheri Jo left the house on Seneca Street at 6:30. So she walked out into full dark, in November, in Michigan. Her route took her to the corner of West Dartmouth and Clio Road, where she waited for her bus. That corner is where the last person who saw her. She was walking to the bus stop. That is the whole of the description that survives. The Michigan State Police summary of the case puts it in one sentence, and it is the flattest, worst sentence in the whole file. Somewhere along the way she was abducted, and was not seen again until 4 days later. Somewhere along the way. A distance of a few hundred yards, on a 4-lane road, at an hour when that road already has traffic on it, in a city of 150,000 people. Nobody saw a car stop. Nobody heard anything. In 43 years of investigation, no witness to the actual abduction has ever been found. She did not arrive at Carmen High School. And the fact that she did not arrive is not, on its own, the kind of thing that starts an emergency in 1983. Schools did not telephone parents when a 16-year-old missed a morning. So the alarm did not go up when she vanished. It went up hours later, when she did not come home. The next 4 days are the part of this case with the least written down, and the most weight. Police in Flint had a missing 16-year-old girl with no scene, no vehicle, no direction of travel, and no witness. There was nothing to search. There was not even a place to start searching. And they had the statistical reality of 1983, which is that most 16-year-olds who do not come home have gone somewhere on purpose. That assumption is right most of the time. It costs everything on the occasions it is wrong. Her mother spent those 4 days doing what every parent in that position does, which is telephoning everybody her daughter had ever mentioned. She has spoken since about what those days were like, about not knowing where her daughter was, and about the specific horror of not knowing whether she was being hurt while they were looking. We now know that she was right to be afraid of exactly that, and we know it because of a piece of evidence that would not surface for another 4 days, and would not be fully understood for years. There is a particular cruelty in the arithmetic of a missing child, and it is this. The first hours are the ones that matter most, and they are also the hours in which nobody yet believes anything is wrong. By the time a search is real, the window has usually closed. In this case the window did not close on the first day, or the second, or the third. It stayed open longer than anybody searching could have imagined, and nobody knew. Flint police did what could be done with nothing. They talked to her friends at Carmen. They talked to the people she babysat for. They worked the household, which is where we are going to come back to in a moment, because that part left a scar. But there was no scene. That is the thing that made this case impossible in 1983. A crime scene is where evidence comes from, and for 4 days there was no crime scene at all, only a corner where a girl had been walking, and then had not been. Because Sheri Jo Elliott did not die on the 16th of November. Blumfield Township is in Saginaw County, about 35 miles north of Flint. It is farm country, flat, open, sugar beet and corn, section roads running dead straight for miles, drainage ditches cut along the field edges to take the water off. In November those ditches are the only cover for miles. Which is why, on the 20th of November, 1983, there was a man out there running a trapline for muskrat along one of them. Trapping is a daily job. You do not set a line and leave it. You walk it every day, because an animal left in a trap overnight is a ruined pelt and, to anybody who traps properly, a thing you do not allow to happen. So this man had walked that ditch the day before. And on the 20th, he found Sheri Jo Elliott. She had been shot 4 times. She had been sexually assaulted. The cause of death recorded was blood loss. That is the entirety of what will be said about the state she was found in. And the trapper told police something that turned out to be the single most important sentence any witness gave in this case for 40 years. He said he checked his lines daily, and that Sheri Jo's body was not there the day before. Put that next to the autopsy, and the shape of what happened to her changes completely. The medical records indicated that Sheri Jo was probably still alive as late as the 19th of November. She disappeared on the morning of the 16th. The ditch was empty on the 19th. She was probably alive on the 19th. Which means that she was not taken and killed. She was taken, and kept, for something like 3 days, and the official record of this case describes the place she was kept in 4 words. An undisclosed location. Undisclosed, in that sentence, does not mean the police are keeping it back. It means nobody knows. 43 years later, with the case closed and the man named, that is still true. There is no building attached to this case. No basement, no cabin, no motel room, no vehicle. Wherever Sheri Jo Elliott spent the last 3 days of her life, it has never been identified, and the only person who could have said is dead. It also changes what the 4 days were, for everybody involved. While Flint police were working a missing persons file, and her mother was telephoning her daughter's friends, and the assumption in the background was that a teenager had gone somewhere on purpose, she was alive. Not for an hour. 4 days. Long enough that a search that found the right place on the 17th, or the 18th, would not have been recovering a body. There is no way to say that which is not unbearable, and there is no honest way to leave it out, because it is the fact that defines this case. The window was open. Nobody knew where to look. And because that place has never been found, there is a piece of physical evidence in this case that was never collected and never will be. Whatever room she was in has had 43 years of other lives in it. Sit with what the family had to absorb, in reverse order. First she was missing. Then she was found. Then, eventually, they were told what the timeline meant. Now, the part of this case that needs to be said carefully and said clearly, because a man's name was in it for 40 years and he was innocent. Early in the investigation, Flint police looked hard at Sheri Jo's stepfather, Robert Schultz. That is not, in itself, a scandal. It is procedure. When a child is killed, investigators start inside the household and work outwards, because that is where the answer statistically is. Every detective would tell you the same thing, and they would be right to. But procedure has a cost, and the cost lands on whoever is standing in it. His wife has described that period since, police trying to say it was her husband, and her answer, which was that he would never hurt a child, ever. She was right. The DNA that eventually solved this case was not his, and it was never going to be his, and it had been sitting in an evidence envelope proving it was not his since 1983. Nobody could read it yet. Robert Schultz died in 2025. He died about a year before the announcement. He never got to hear the name. He never got to hear anybody say out loud that it was not him. That is the second clock running in this story, and almost nobody notices it. The forensic science arrived. It arrived roughly 12 months too late for the man who had been carrying the suspicion. Between the middle of the 1980s and the early 2020s, the file did what these files do. Crime Stoppers ran a poster. It is a plain sheet with her school photograph on it and a headline in capital letters across the top, phrased in the first person, the way those posters are. Do you know who killed me? Cash reward up to $2,500. Anonymous. Anonymous. Anonymous, 3 times across the top of the page. Under the photograph, 4 short paragraphs lay out everything the police could prove: the address, the time she left, the corner where she was last seen, the trapper, the ditch, and the sentence about the 19th of November. That poster is, in a real sense, the whole case for 4 decades. Everything known, on one page, waiting for somebody to walk in with the missing piece. Nobody ever did. Her mother kept a scrapbook. In the news footage from 2026 you can see it, a binder with tab dividers, and inside, photographs of a girl in a swimsuit on a beach with a ball, a girl in a school portrait with feathered hair, a girl in a summer top squinting at whoever is holding the camera. 43 years of birthdays that did not happen, kept in a ring binder. Cases like this do not stay still, exactly. They get picked up. A new detective inherits the box, reads it over a winter, tries the 2 or 3 things that were not possible last time, and puts it back. The Michigan State Police reopened this file more than once across those decades. Each time, the same wall, a biological sample that could tell them exactly who, in a form nobody could yet turn into a name. Think about how strange that is as a situation. From about 1986 onward, the police in this case were in physical possession of the answer. They could hold the envelope. They simply could not read what was written on the inside of it. The first generation of DNA testing could compare a sample to a named suspect. If you had a man, it could tell you yes or no. What it could not do was start from the sample and arrive at a man. For that, this case had to wait about another 30 years. And in an evidence store somewhere in Michigan, in an envelope, was the biological material that would end it, and had been able to end it, in principle, since about 1986. What was missing was not the evidence. It was the method. In 2023, the Michigan State Police 3rd District Cold Case Unit reopened the file. And the first thing that had to happen was not scientific. It was clerical, and it was enormous. 40 years of investigative material, statements, tips, reports, photographs, laboratory paperwork, existed as paper in boxes, in no consistent order, indexed by nothing. You cannot run a modern investigation on that. You cannot search it. You cannot cross-reference a name in a 1984 tip sheet against a name in a 2023 genealogy tree if the tip sheet is in a box and the box is in a basement. So the work went to students. Western Michigan University runs a cold case program, and beginning in 2023 its students reorganized and digitized decades of material in this case, and ran open-source research on persons of interest. Undergraduates, scanning paper. That is the unglamorous middle of this story, and it is genuinely load-bearing. Without a searchable file, the genealogy work that came later has nothing to check itself against. With the file readable, the Michigan State Police Forensic Science Division and Othram went to work on the evidence itself. Othram is a laboratory in Texas that does one thing: it builds a usable genome out of biological material that every other laboratory has already declared too small, too old, or too degraded to work with. What it produces is not the 20-marker barcode that the National Offender Database uses. A barcode answers one question: is this the same person as that person? And if the man is not in the database, the barcode answers nothing at all, forever. What Othram builds is hundreds of thousands of markers across the whole genome. That is not an identifier. That is a family tree, written down. And a family tree can be compared against people who have never been arrested in their lives. That is the whole reason this wave of cases is being cleared right now. Millions of ordinary people have uploaded their own DNA to genealogy sites looking for cousins. Some of those sites allow police to search, with permission. The killer does not have to be in a database. His relatives do. And almost everybody has relatives. From the matches, investigators build family trees backwards through census records, marriages, obituaries, birth certificates, and then prune. Wrong age, cut. Wrong state, cut. Dead before 1983, cut. Not in Michigan that November, cut. It is slow. It is also contested, and it is worth saying so. Reading a crime scene sample against a genealogy database means using the DNA of people who never consented, in order to find a relative they may not know they have. Those arguments are real and they are not going away. In this particular case, though, the arithmetic was not complicated. A man abducted a 16-year-old girl in 1983, kept her for 3 days, killed her, and was never questioned. There was no other route left to his name. And at the end of the pruning, the tree came down to one man. Ronnie Collins was 75 years old and lived in Grand Blanc, which is a suburb on the south side of Flint. 15 miles from Seneca Street. In November of 1983 he would have been about 33. He was, at that time, a traveling musician working around the area. Which means a man who drove, at night, between towns, alone, with a reason to be on any road at any hour, and nobody expecting him anywhere in particular. Investigators found no connection between Ronnie Collins and Sheri Jo Elliott. Not a neighbor, not a relative, not a friend of a friend, not a customer, not a coincidence of address. Nothing. Their conclusion was that this was a random crime. A girl walking to a bus stop in the dark, and a man who happened to be driving past. That is the hardest category of case to solve and the hardest to hear, because there is no reason in it. There was nothing she could have done differently, except be somewhere else. By early 2026 the genealogy had brought investigators to his name. What they needed next was a direct sample, to turn a strong inference into a fact. Collins did not voluntarily provide a DNA sample. And then, in January of 2026, before investigators obtained one, Ronnie Collins took his own life. There is a question sitting inside that sentence, and this video is not going to answer it, because no source can. Nobody has said publicly whether he knew that a genealogy tree had narrowed onto him. He may have known. He may not have. 43 years of not being asked a single question, and then, in the weeks when the file finally reached him, that. Draw whatever line you want between those two facts. The record does not draw it for you. It is worth noticing what his refusal actually tells you, which is less than it feels like. Plenty of innocent people decline to hand police their DNA, for reasons that have nothing to do with guilt. A refusal is not evidence. What settled this was not his answer. It was his autopsy. And notice the timing from the other side of the table. The investigators had spent 3 years rebuilding this file. They had a name. They were one sample away from being able to tell a mother who took her daughter. And then the sample walked out of reach. For a few weeks in the winter of 2026, this case was solved and unprovable at the same time. What happened next is procedural and blunt. A death like that means an autopsy. An autopsy means a biological sample. The DNA gathered at Ronnie Collins's autopsy was compared against the DNA recovered from Sheri Jo Elliott's body in 1983. It matched. He had refused to give them a sample. In the end he gave them one anyway. On the 13th of April, 2026, the Michigan State Police announced that the 1983 kidnapping and homicide of Sheri Jo Elliott was solved. Be precise about what that announcement is. Ronnie Collins was never charged. He was never tried. He was never convicted. He died before any of that could begin. What exists is a conclusion by a police agency, supported by a DNA comparison, in a case that can never now be taken to a court. That is not the same thing as a verdict, and the distinction is going to matter more and more as genetic genealogy clears more of these files and finds more of the men already dead. Sheri Jo's mother spoke to the local station in Flint after the announcement. She said the DNA was pretty much an admission of guilt, and that it proved he did it. She also said, plainly, that she was glad he was dead, and that she was still processing it. Nobody should be asked to be graceful about this, and she was not required to be. What she said to other families still waiting was that there is still hope. And then, immediately after, the part people skip, that it does not change anything in her life. That she still misses her daughter every day, that she will for the rest of her life, and that it is something you never get over. Both halves of that are true at once, and any version of this story that only tells you the first half is lying to you. The reporter contacted the Collins family for comment and did not hear back. There is nothing else to say about them, and this is where saying things about them stops. There is one more thing this case says, and it is not about Michigan. Every element that solved it was borrowed. The genome sequencing came from a private laboratory in another state. The genealogy came from an FBI team. The clerical work came from university students who were not born when the crime happened. The one thing the local agency supplied was the thing it had been supplying, silently, at cost, for 40 years, it kept the box. It paid to store a sealed envelope through 4 decades of budget cuts in a city that was cutting everything. That is the unglamorous lesson underneath almost every one of these cases. The science can arrive late. It cannot arrive at all if somebody, decades earlier, did not decide to keep something they had no way of using. There are tens of thousands of those envelopes sitting in evidence rooms in the United States right now, attached to cases nobody is working. The rate at which they get read is a budget question, not a scientific one. So here is the accounting. A 16-year-old girl left a house on Seneca Street at 6:30 in the morning to catch a bus, in the dark, in November. She was taken somewhere between her front door and a corner 2 blocks away. She was held for 3 days in a place that has never been found. She was killed. She was left in a drainage ditch 35 miles north, in a ditch a man happened to walk every single day. For 43 years her mother did not know. For most of those years her stepfather lived under a suspicion that the evidence in the envelope could have cleared at any point after 1986, if anybody had known how to read it. He died a year before it was read. It took a state police cold case unit, a laboratory in Texas, a genealogy team, and a group of university students scanning paper, to arrive at a name 15 miles away. And the man who had that name was gone 11 weeks before they could put a question to him. There is no scene in this where somebody is made to answer for it. That is not how most of these end. The DNA arrives, and the name arrives, and the answer arrives, and there is nobody left standing in the room to receive any of it except the family. Sheri Jo Elliott was 16. She went to Carmen High School. She babysat on weekends. People who knew her said she was shy, and intelligent, and careful around strangers. The place she was held for those 3 days has still never been identified, and now, almost certainly, it never will be. Thank you for watching Picket Fence Crimes.